Welcome to Neurodivergent Faith, a podcast to help you navigate the beautiful and complicated intersection of neurodivergence and Christian faith and practice. Whether you're neurodivergent yourself, or you're a friend, family member, or church leader seeking to understand more about the neurodivergent Christian experience, you're in the right place. My name's Josh Davis. I'm autistic, ADHD, a spiritual director, and an ordained pastor. And I'm delighted to have you join me as we explore the unique ways neurodivergent people experience God, worship, community, and scripture, along with special interests, sensory and attention differences, social and communication challenges, and much more. Together, we'll break down barriers, confront misconceptions and assumptions, and celebrate the beautiful diversity of God's creation in all of us. So, if you're ready to think deeply and creatively, to reconcile your faith and your brain wiring, or you just want to hear what it sounds like when neurodivergence and Christianity have a conversation, come on in. It's a bit messy, definitely interesting, and we wouldn't have it any other way. We don't do small talk here, so let's jump into something real, raw, and robust. Are you ready? Take a deep breath. Hold it. And let it out with a sigh. All right, here we go. Hey everyone, Josh Davis here, and I'm excited to share with you our very first interview on the podcast. I've learned some things in this process, and one of those is that I should turn off the space heater in my office, even though it's cold, so we don't get that background noise. Also learned that speaking over one another on Zoom messes with the audio. So in future interviews, I hope to have better audio quality. But I'm learning, and I am really excited to get to share this interview with you with Quan Nguyen. He is Vietnamese-American on the autism spectrum. We talk about everything from special interests to what makes church challenging, and really spent some time focusing in on Quan's story, his discovery and diagnosis story, and how he sees God involved in that story. So a lot of beauty, a lot of laughter and goodness, even some tears, and I'm excited to invite you into it. So as an autistic person myself, hellos and goodbyes can be pretty awkward. So I don't have a clean intro or outro with Quan, so we're just going to jump right in. Here we go. You good on your end?
I'm good on my end.
I'm sitting here under my weighted blanket and my chair that moves around, so I should be all right. So I'm just really excited to be able to be in this space with you and to have this conversation. So why don't you just start by introducing yourself? Tell us your name and your neurotype and anything else you want us to know about you.
Sure. So my name is Quan Nguyen. I'm on the autism spectrum. I was diagnosed as autism spectrum disorder level 1, which was previously known as Asperger's.
Right.
So that's what my neurotype is. And as far as anything you know about me, I currently serve as a website developer for a nonprofit humanitarian aid organization here based out of Akron, Pennsylvania. So we do basically relief, development, and peace work in the name of Christ. So we do work overseas in Africa, build wells. We do stuff with immigration, climate change. Basically my company or my organization is called Mennonite Central Committee. Mm-hmm. So it's a worldwide organization. So basically, the main office that I work in is in Akron, Pennsylvania. There's an office in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada as well. So I kind of straddle both countries as far as my job, so I'm excited to really dig into this topic. So yeah.
Thanks for being here. It makes me really happy. You said you're diagnosed autism spectrum level 1. Was it called Asperger's when you got your diagnosis? I know some people when they get their diagnosis, especially if it was a few years back, it gets called Asperger's, and then that's kind of how they identify.
Yeah. So, I got my diagnosis in 2016, and they had called it Asperger's, or they had called it ASD level 1, and then the the facility that diagnosed me said it used to be called Asperger's. It would, so it was a more common name maybe early, maybe, 10,
Before
15 years
that.
ago before
Yeah.
that. So they told me that they just kind of diagnosed it in different levels. So,
Yeah.
yep.
And how do you prefer to talk about that? Do you prefer to be called autistic, or someone who has autism, or someone who's on the autism spectrum? Like, how do you refer to yourself, and how do you prefer for others to talk about
I,
that?
I've always said that that autism is just a small part of who I am as a person. So I don't say that I'm autistic. I just say I'm on the spectrum.
Yeah.
I'm on the autism spectrum. So that's kind of how I've told people, that you can just say I'm on the autism spectrum.
Yeah. Great. So next question is, what's something that bothers you a lot or drives you crazy?
Yeah. So one thing that really drives me crazy is if I'm trying to focus on something like at church, for example, and I'm trying to focus on what the pastor's saying, and there's a constant noise that's like behind me, whether it's a baby crying or somebody like tapping their foot or whatever, and it's a constant sustained noise. My brain literally says, make it stop.
Yeah.
Make it stop because it's like I'm like trying to I'm like hyper focused on what the pastor's trying to say, and then there's this noise in the background. It's like make it stop already. So yeah, that's one thing that really bothers me.
Yeah. If you weren't so controlled and filtered in those moments, would you want to scream, or would you want to get out of there, or what would you want to do
But
when that noise is?
both. I mean, I would probably scream if it was a church setting. Obviously, I wouldn't scream. I would just get up and leave. But in other settings, I probably would scream, or find like a much more quieter place to
Yeah.
to just kind of like sit, decompress, and just kind of let the silence take over.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing you say is also it's really hard for you to maintain focus on the thing that you want to focus on, which could be a sermon in church or whatever's happening,
Hmm.
because that sound is just so present to you.
Yeah,
Like in
yeah,
truth, it feels like it's threatening.
yeah, for sure. And it's like because part of autism is fight, flight, and freeze, and like my brain is just like it's like freezing, or it's just like it's just working hard to try to focus on you know what I'm trying to focus on, and so it just kind of works a little too hard. Hmm.
I'm right there with you.
Yep.
On the other side, what's something that you really enjoy that you could talk about or research or be immersed in for hours?
I love baseball and I love baseball statistics. I could talk your ear off for hours about anything related to baseball statistics. When I was about, I would say maybe 8 or 9, I went into this bookstore at the local mall and I saw this huge book of like baseball statistics, and I just started reading it like basically from cover to cover. Like it was like
Yes.
things like that. And I was just immersed. Like I didn't want to leave the bookstore because I was so immersed in statistics. And I'd always loved numbers. I was always good in math and things like that. But then, and I love baseball just watching it because
Hmm.
I grew up watching Mike Schmidt and the Phillies and all that. And then I just realized that, the older I got, the more obsessed I got with baseball statistics and numbers and just fantasy baseball, fantasy football. I mean, anything that involves statistics, I could talk your ear off for hours about it. That's when I kind of knew that, there's some, like there was something there. There was
Hmm.
something with my brain that I was like, okay, I'm I was that's like the one thing I would always like focus on and just talk about. I had a hard time talking about other things, but you get me going on sports.
Did you ever get into baseball cards, collecting baseball cards?
Oh yeah. I used to collect baseball cards and I used to make starting lineups. Yeah, like I had cards from like different years from like 1987 all the way to like 2000, and I would because I love baseball and how it works. I pretended that I was a manager, so I would just create my own starting lineup, starting rotation,
Yeah.
bullpen, the whole thing. So
I can
yeah,
imagine you just enjoying that for hours.
yeah, and my first computer was a Commodore 64, so that tells you how old I am, right?
Okay.
So I would always there was always two games I would play, and there were always like baseball video games. And at the end of the game, you could print out the box score. So
Mhm.
obviously, I printed out the box score just and then studied that thing on hours on end just to see, okay, how well did Carlton Fisk do against the 1980 Phillies? Or I was immersed
Yeah.
in that. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite team or favorite player, with whether that was like a player that used to play and doesn't play anymore or is currently playing?
Well, yeah. So my favorite player growing up was Mike Schmidt. Yeah, from the Phillies. He played third base and a little bit of first in his
Hmm?
career. And it was actually the year that he hit his 500th career home run, which was 1987. I was actually watching it on television, and it was against the Pittsburgh Pirates. And they were away, so the Phillies were the visiting team. And I remember watching that, and Don Robinson was the pitcher, and he threw a nice fat little pitch right over home plate, and Schmidt just about walloped that thing. So yeah, so he ended up that year, and then he retired in 1989. So I remember, like, 87, 88 were like he started he was starting to fade a little bit, but it was nice to see him hit, number 500 on television.
Yeah. And were you in
That was,
Pennsylvania at the time? Because that's
yep.
two Pennsylvania teams I noticed.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a Phillies fan since for as long as I can remember. So yeah.
That's
Mhm.
awesome. Thanks for
Yep.
sharing.
You got it.
So yeah, tell me a little bit about what it was like for you growing up, not understanding that your brain was different, but kind of knowing it. It sounds like at the same time. It's like, what was it like for you growing up?
It was hard because, like, I didn't have a lot of friends growing up, and I never knew why.
Hmm.
I always got picked on, and I didn't know why.
Hmm.
And like, I knew growing up that I was very socially awkward, but I didn't know why. I just knew that I was very smart in math. I knew I was just very smart with numbers, but I had a really hard time, like, making friends. I really had a hard time keeping friends that I had, and I always got picked on, but I never knew why. And I would always ask, why are you guys picking on me? And nobody would ever tell me.
Oh,
So that's when I knew that, okay, so maybe there's something with me brain wise that's kind of coming out in a way that to me seems normal, but to other people seems awkward. And obviously, but elementary school, 8 or 9 year old, I mean, it's pretty brutal.
yeah.
And
So how did you
that
respond to that? Like a lot of different people respond different ways. Some people try to fit in as much as they can. Some people try to say, forget it, I can't fit in. I'm just going to kind of do my own thing over here. What was your response to feeling like you were getting bullied and you didn't know why?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I had a bunch of different reactions. I think one was I tried really hard to make friends. And I also, but at the same time, I also kind of kept to myself because, to your point, sometimes you just kind of like close off and then you're like, okay, what's the use? So I think it kind of flowed with how I was feeling at the time. But yeah, it was hard to, like, because in my mind, I felt like what I was doing was normal,
Right.
but 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 then in a social setting, it was like I would always be, like, laughed at or whatever, and it was hard. Like, there were times I would actually cry too, because, like, why is it so hard for me to make friends? And my family dynamic made it harder because, like, my dad even thought that I was, there was something wrong with me as well.
Oh,
And so he didn't understand, mental health things at the time. He just thought that I was just weird. So
and
yeah,
is that something he said to you? Like he felt like there was something wrong and weird?
yeah, because he would compare me to, like, other people. Like, there was another person who was my age, and he had friends left and right, and also Vietnamese like myself, and he's like, why, what's wrong with you that you can't have friends? And this guy, this neighbor kid who, has all these friends. It's like, and then I said, I don't know. I
Oh,
really don't know. I just knew something was different, but I didn't know what it was.
feels really lonely as you talk about it. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
And especially as a kid, because you didn't have access to the information, you didn't understand what was going on and didn't
No,
have a
right.
lot of help navigating it, it sounds like.
Yeah, and growing up, because I grew up in the 80s, and, autism wasn't a thing then. Asperger's wasn't a thing then. Everything was just kind of clumped into ADHD and things like that. But I was never diagnosed with anything because I was just super smart. So I just kind of went that direction rather than maybe I should go get tested for something, because that was one, unheard of, and two, the Vietnamese culture that I grew up in, mental health is kind of like poo-pooed upon, in a sense, like, you want to keep up appearances. So if your kid might have a potential mental health issue, that makes you look bad, as parents. So it's like, yeah, what do you do?
Right. What do you do? And what do you do
Right.
as a kid who's just showing up in the world the way you know how to show up in the world? And it is normal for you, the way you were interacting with everybody, but it wasn't going well. And maybe it was embarrassing to your parents.
Mhm.
That's tough.
Yeah.
And you were a Vietnamese kid growing up in what,
In
a
America.
diverse area or mostly white area? Or what was it like culturally?
Mostly white. Like Lancaster City, like the neighborhood that I lived in, there was me, there was another Vietnamese family down the street, and then my grandparents lived 1 block away from us. So it was, there was smatterings of Asians,
Mhm.
and just in my direct neighborhood, but it was majority was white.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that's hard enough, right? Growing up as a
Yeah.
minority
Hmm.
in school culture, but then also you're a minority with your neurotype and your brain functions differently than the
Yeah.
majority.
Hmm.
That's like 2 times as hard, it sounds like.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. You, did you go to church growing up, and was your church Vietnamese or was it a mixed race church? What was it like?
It was Vietnamese. Yeah, we had a church in Lancaster City, and maybe about 200 people. So what made it hard is I felt like I didn't fit in there either. Yeah, because again, being neurodivergent, and at that time, again, I came across even as awkward to people in my own peer group.
Yeah.
So yeah,
So you didn't fit in with other Vietnamese kids at church, and you didn't fit in with the kids at school,
yeah,
and you didn't know why.
exactly,
And this is before your diagnosis, so you didn't even have access to information. No one had access to the information about what was going on with you.
correct.
Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like then to discover that you are on the autism spectrum and that your brain was designed to function differently than the people around you? Like, what was that like? And did you see God involved in that process of discovery or diagnosis?
Yeah, definitely. So, like I said, I was diagnosed in 2016, so as an adult, and yeah, that whole thing was a God thing, because like my wife and I, we were having some issues in our marriage, so we've been going to marriage counseling, things like
Mm-hmm.
that. And so my wife, was just talking to a random was to a family member couple at church, and she was kind of just saying, we were having issues with communicating and intimacy and things like that.
Yeah.
And this couple said, well, is Quan on the autism spectrum by any chance? Because this couple was actually dealing with this issue where their daughter was who was in high school at the time was on the spectrum. So my wife Laura said, I don't know, we never actually explored. So then as I was reading up on, like, this was before I actually had the diagnosis, I was reading up on, okay, so what is autism, and what is what does all that, what are the symptoms, what are the traits of autism? And I'm reading it all, I'm like, I think we should pursue this. I think we should take a look at it, because I feel like this is me,
Mm.
and what was interesting was, so I called. I was recommended a place in East Petersburg, Pennsylvania, that specializes in autism. Autism and developmental disabilities is what they call it.
Yeah.
So they do, so where they do the testing and they do the diagnosis and they do autism-based counseling. So I was able to get the diagnosis. It was like a multi-step process,
Mm-hmm.
where there was like the initial intake, and then there was me talking to the counselor, and then the third part was like a questionnaire that you would send like your closest friends, that they would answer honestly about you, and then the
Yeah.
fourth part was, here's their diagnosis. So after that fourth session, they said, you're on the autism spectrum, level 1, which is Asperger's.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it was a huge relief in a
Mm.
way, because I felt like, okay, now I know what I have. I can finally put a name to it. And so it was a huge relief. And it's funny, like, I never actually blamed God for it at first, because it's like, okay, you would think I would, because of everything I experienced growing up with being bullied and picked on and, you know, verbally abused and things like that because of my social awkwardness and things like that.
Yeah.
I never actually blamed God for it. Because I'm like, okay, I think I thank God because I now have the diagnosis. I now know what I have, and now we can proceed with, with autism-based counseling. Like, what does that mean for me now? How does that change how I look, how I communicate, how does that change our marriage dynamic as well now? Because like my wife is neurotypical, I'm neurodivergent. So how does that work now with
Right.
one partner who's neurodivergent and another partner who's not?
That's
So
cross-cultural communication right there. Yeah.
yeah, and what was interesting as well was when, the whole when I first met the therapist, they said something that kind of took me aback, and it's like there's not a lot of resources out there for adults who are diagnosed with autism later in life. Most of their therapy was geared towards kids who
Yeah.
are on the spectrum. In a way, my wife and I were kind of like like an experimental guinea pigs in a way. Like, how do you do therapy for somebody who was diagnosed for autism as an adult?
Yeah. Even the diagnostic processes, they're changing now, but it's 10 years ago, they were designed for kids. And so
Hmm.
one of the things I heard you say is that it felt like a relief. And I really connect with that too. When
Hmm.
I got my diagnosis, I remember just feeling such a relief to know now I know how I can work with my brain instead of working with against it. And
Right.
the people around me can understand. Maybe I can imagine maybe some of the challenges you were having in communication with your wife uh, were that were a result of the way you process the world, and not like you were trying to be mean or trying to be uncaring or whatever the
Yeah.
case may be. But like I've noticed that I have really direct communication and I say exactly what I mean, but sometimes that
Yep.
comes across as rude to
Hmm.
people. And when I finally began to understand that, and the people closest to me began to understand it, then they could hear my words differently. And that was such a
Right.
relief too.
Right. And for me, like one of the things that I was always told that I come across like I don't care. But
Mm,
one of the things that I learned about my diagnosis is that I care deeply.
mm.
Sometimes I just have a hard time expressing it, or when I do express it, it all comes out in one shot. Like it comes out like it's not like a trickle. It comes out like a tidal wave. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
Hmm.
So, what's it been like for you after your diagnosis? How have your relationships changed? Your relationship with yourself, the way you think about yourself, your relationship with others, and your relationship with God.
Yeah, so it's been challenging, I'm not gonna lie. There's still a lot of things that I struggle with. Like sometimes I do have trouble like regulating my emotions sometimes. Like when things get overwhelmed, it just gets to a point where I just have to like let it all out. I always use the example of like, a car where sometimes when the bad gas gets in, sometimes it's got to get out, and it doesn't matter how it gets out, it just has to get out.
Yeah,
So, so there's been challenges there, but at the same time, I've also been able to get tools to learn how to regulate it when I can remember to use the tools.
right.
Um, so I've learned, different techniques as far as how to, regulate myself. Um, Relationship wise, I mean, it's still a work in progress. Like I think my wife is a lot more understanding now of my, idiosyncrasy, so to speak, with autism and,
Yeah,
um, uh, I'm also learning how to, like I also know that I need to make an effort as well to, rewire my brain in a way, like, like learning to read the room better, learning to, when to take deep breaths and not just, bull rush into something. Also knowing how to, like, if I'm starting to feel something, to express it rather than just keep it in.
yeah,
And so again, that's a work in progress. I'm not perfect. I'm far from perfect, and that's something I think I'm probably going to learn the rest of my life. I'm never going to get to a place where I feel like I'm there. It's going to be baby steps for me.
While you're talking about that, it makes me think about like I grew up as a missionary kid. So I was born in the U.S. and then we moved to Costa Rica and then Dominican Republic. And when you move cross-culturally, it's a lot of work to learn a different language and to learn a different way of relating to people, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And a lot of what you're talking about, even in relationship with your wife, is both of you are like trying to learn each other's language and culture. Yeah. And that's going to take the rest of your life. You'll always be learning. And you've always got what's natural to you.
Yeah. And as far as just my relationship with my friends, I think now that I've told them, and now now they're much more patient with me. Like, one of the things that before I got my diagnosis, so I have a tabletop board game group that that meets every Sunday night. And there was a period of time there where my friends got annoyed with me because I would take a long time to make a turn because I'm like because my brain's like analyzing everything.
Yeah.
So and I know that's also part of my diagnosis as well, is I like to analyze every possible thing before I make a move. And sometimes it might come across as I'm stalling or I'm intentionally just being slow. But now that they've understood that, that part of my diagnosis is I analyze every possible, scenario, and it might take me a long time, and then sometimes I might get overwhelmed, and I just make a move just to make a move. But now they're much more gracious about it. They're much more understanding about who I am as somebody who's neurodivergent. So now they don't rush me into making a turn anymore. So
that's really beautiful.
Yeah.
I imagine that part of your brain, the analytical part of your brain, comes in handy with the work that you do in certain ways. I could imagine that being a real asset. And then also, making your board game playing probably slower than your friends.
Yeah.
Because you're taking more into consideration. What about the way you see yourself? Has that changed since your diagnosis?
It's taken time to do that. Like initially, when I first got the diagnosis, even though I was relieved, in a way, I felt like I was like imperfect, or like I felt like I was, initially I felt like there was something wrong with me, and things like that. But then, and Josh, what's really been, I'm going to get emotional here.
It's okay.
What's really been helpful is I've been able to share my story with other people, and I'm realizing that there's that.
Take your time. I can tell this is really important to you, and you feel it deeply. I'm with you.
There's that verse in Scripture that says that we are Christ's workmanship. We are Christ's masterpiece.
Yes.
And it's taken me a long time to realize that I'm Christ's masterpiece. Like I'm a beautiful work of art. Wow. It's taken me a long time. I'm 46, and it's taken me 46 years to realize. Because growing up, I never felt that I was good for anything. I never felt like that I was beautiful or whatever. And as I've shared with people at work, I've shared with church, my story about my autism journey, I've realized that through it all, God has been there to show me that He loves me for who I am. He created me who I am, and I'm His workmanship. That I'm created to do good things, to do good works, and that I've taken a lot of comfort in that.
I celebrate that with you. I got tears in my eyes as you were talking. Just the hard work it can be to align our understanding of ourselves with God's understanding of us, right? God says, "You're my workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works." And like you said, it's taken 46 years for you to embrace that.
And then there are times that I still do beat myself up and wish that I was normal. Like sometimes when my wife and I disagree on something, and it's like sometimes I blame myself, like, why did I say it like that, or why was I feel stupid for saying that, and through therapy, I've realized that, normal is a spectrum.
Yeah.
It's not like there's no one definition of normal. Like for me, my neurodivergence is my normal.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, so being able to hear that through a therapist, and this, the grace that I've gotten from my wife and from my friends and my wife's side of the family has been encouraging. And also just, having, like, when I've shared with friends and people at work and hearing them say, I feel like my partner has the same sort of um, same sort of thing as you do.
Hmm.
Uh, it makes me realize that I'm not alone in this. And and hearing your story, Josh, and when you on Facebook, when you shared it, like, I'm not alone. And the right people will surround you with with the right encouragement, the right support. So, and I take comfort in that. But at the same time, I still deal with, like, beating myself up, being my own worst enemy, my own, being my harshest critic.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a mix of different emotions. Whereas, like, some days I feel like I treat myself better, but then there are days where I don't.
I get it.
Yeah.
I sent you a list of questions beforehand, and this question's coming to me now. So if you don't want to answer it, feel free not to answer it. We'll cut it out. But I wonder, knowing what you know now and understanding what you understand now, and having experienced what you've experienced, if you could go back as yourself now, and you could go talk to your elementary school self, maybe after a particularly hard day at school with bullying and misunderstandings,
Hmm.
what would you say to him?
Oh boy. I would say that you're beautiful just as you are. That's what I would say.
Hmm.
Because, that 8-year-old Quan would not have thought that. That 8-year-old Quan would have been like, what is wrong with me? Why am I so weird?
Hmm.
Why am I so awkward? I would go back and say, Quan, you are beautiful just as you are. God loves you. God created you, and God did not make a mistake with you.
That's beautiful. And I can also imagine just hanging out with him around baseball stats for a while.
Oh yeah.
So, a few last questions here, and some of these I'm going to try to ask each person I do interviews with. Thanks for being my very first interview, by the way.
I
This is so much fun
appreciate
for
that.
me.
Yeah.
What's one way that you see God's character revealed in your neurodivergence, if
Oh
any?
wow.
That might be really hard to access, but I'm curious.
Yeah, this was the question that I think was hardest for me to think of an answer on. Um, I think, I don't know if this qualifies as God's character or not, but I've definitely seen his grace, his love, but also his caring spirit. And I've just seen it that, like, I've always said that, that Jesus is the father I wish I had,
Hmm.
and I I've seen that, just in my life, especially even before the diagnosis, but ever since the diagnosis, when I've had opportunities to kind of share my story, and seeing, just the support that I've gotten from, the people, from my colleagues, my friends, my wife's side of the family, um, and people who are also on the spectrum as well, that understand,
Yeah,
this, that I've definitely just seen God work in a way that, I feel like God wants me to share this story with people, because I feel like there are people who are afraid to share the story for one reason or another. And for you or for myself to, to just be out there and say, hey, I'm neurodivergent. I'm an open book, like, I am who I am, and I'm not ashamed about it. I'm not going to hold back on it. This is who I am. And, for better or for worse, you know, but I just, yeah, I just feel like God's love, God's grace, God's, forgiveness for the times where I have been upset with him about it. I've seen it just kind of permeate in different parts of my journey, and just, yeah.
Yeah. Something I want to offer you, just as I've been listening to you talk, I think one way maybe you might reflect God's image, in addition to what you just said, when you were talking about how when you play tabletop board games, you analyze everything before you make a decision. And I just have known that about God my whole life, how God takes so much into consideration. Like
Yeah.
as humans, when we make decisions, we're only thinking on a few different levels, maybe. Maybe some of us, like you, actually take in more levels of processing and analysis. But God actually is taking in so much information
Yeah.
all the time, right?
Mhm.
And processing all of that into decisions, working on so many different levels at the same time. And I see a glimpse of that when you talk about your own brain process that points me to who God is.
Yeah, because for me, the way my brain works is because, and it kind of goes in, with my work as a developer, where it's like, if this happens, what happens then? If this happens, what happens then? That's just how my brain has always worked,
Yep,
analyzing every possible thing and what could happen. And yeah.
I get it. I have some similarities there. Next question is, what is one of the hardest parts of church gatherings or church services for you, and why?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I think that was the second hardest question to for me to answer. Um, well, I kind of alluded to it earlier on when, with the whole thing with the noise,
Hmm.
and things like that. But I think for me, one of the hardest parts about church gathering is that knowing that there might be people that don't understand the diagnosis, and and so, I communicate a certain way, and so maybe they might be turned off by it or whatever. And these people at church, there are people in church that don't believe in counseling. They feel like, if you go to therapy, then you're not showing complete faith in God. And for me, it's like, yeah, I do believe that God is the great physician, and he can work, and he can help me to go through this. But mental health is something that can't be totally healed. You just have to learn how to manage it, and you just have to learn how to live with it. And so so I know that there's a subset of people at church that say, don't go to therapy because that shows a complete lack of faith in God. And it's like, I don't believe that for 1 second. So going back to the context of your question, it's difficult in the sense that sometimes things can get really noisy. And so it's hard for me to focus on what the pastor's saying. And sometimes the sound does overwhelm me. And it's like, sometimes I shut down too.
Is that one of your most sensitive senses, is hearing, or do you have sensitivities in a variety of your senses? Sight, smell, touch, taste?
I would say hearing is probably, the most sensitive part for me. Like I said, if I'm focused, I need to hear one thing. If a second thing happens, yeah.
Yes.
It's the same thing with a phone call. Like, if I'm on the phone call and somebody's talking to me in the background, it's like I just want them to like I need complete silence. I would say I feel like touch might be another sensitivity for me. Like it's for various reasons. As far as high sensitivity would be those two senses.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Does that ever become an issue at church for you? Like here in the south of the U.S., there's a lot of hugging that happens at church with people and random strangers. I've realized is not comfortable for me, but I'm still trying to figure out how to navigate that in a church space.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Well, actually, hugging for me is pretty good. Like I do it myself,
okay.
but a hug is fine. Handshakes are fine. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I got
Yep.
you. Last question. What encouragement would you give to other neurodivergent people out there who are listening to this podcast? And they may know they're neurodivergent, or they may just be getting curious about their own
Hmm.
brains in this process. Like, what encouragement would you give?
Yeah, for me, I would tell them, if you even have a suspicion of being neurodivergent, I would say go and find a get the diagnosis. Just if anything, just for peace of mind. Share your story.
Hmm.
Share your story, because there are other people that probably have a similar story, and it's almost like a fraternity, or or we have our own community. Like anybody who's on the spectrum, we have our own community because we understand what each other is going through. So don't be afraid to share your story, and your spouses or your partners or whatever, they'll understand, and they're part. They will work with you to understand you, and to communicate in the way that fits with you. And also another encouragement is your people will be there. Like not everybody is going to understand your diagnosis, but the people that will are your people. Like it's amazing how the more people I've shared it with, the more people have always said, Quanah, we always had a suspicion, but now we know, and we get it. We understand. So the right people will show up for you. Also that, God did not make a mistake with you. So yeah, just be encouraged at that, knowing that God did not make a mistake with you. You are God's workmanship, and you are beautiful in the eyes of God. And so that's what I want to. That's probably the one thing I want to share most of all is that. And you are normal. Your neurodiverse, your neurodivergence is normal, and don't compare yourself to like a person who's neurotypical, because that's just going to be an exercise in futility. But just embrace your neurodivergence. Obviously, and learn to adjust, learn to make changes, whatever changes you need to make as well. But in God's eyes, you're perfect. You're a masterpiece, and the right people will come and be around you and support you. And don't be afraid to share your story, because you never know who might be struggling with the exact same thing and just needs to hear that they're not alone.
Well, that's what I really get from you today, as you share. And as I've been thinking about it, it's cool to me how in this stage of your life, you're actually experiencing more connection with people, a deeper connection with people, as you share your own experience and as you share your own feelings and your own story. And that's what 8-year-old Quan was longing for, was that kind of connection with people back then. And you're getting that now, as you learn to accept yourself and to share your story so generously with others. So thank you. Thanks for sharing your story with us today. I'm excited about those who are listening, how it's going to touch them, what they're going to connect with, and how that will inspire them to share their story and get curious about how they are God's workmanship.
Yeah. And Josh, thank you for the opportunity to do this. Like I've always told people I'm an open book. I am. If you have any questions about my diagnosis or whatever, I'm an open book.
I really like that about you, and I feel safe with you because of that. As I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I didn't do a clean sign-off with Quan, but I just want to say a huge thank you to Quan for being generous with your words, with your expressions, with your stories. I'm glad you're a part of this conversation. And thank you to you listeners for being part of this conversation too. Love to hear from you on social media. Thanks for listening to this episode of Neurodivergent Faith. If you like what you heard, consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing this with someone who might need to hear it too. And as you continue to wrestle with faith and identity, remember, your unique brain is a part of God's creative genius. Whether it's the way you process scripture, engage with prayer, or connect with others, you are a reflection of the vast creativity of our Creator. May you trust that God knows you, delights in you, and is working in you exactly as you are. And may you know that you are not walking this journey alone. See you next time.